Hello class. Welcome to your first online lecture for History 4885, History of Sports in American Society. And for those of you that may not know, my name is Dr. Alex Mendoza. I'm an associate professor at UNT. I've been in the Department of History since the year 2010. So normally I specialize in military history, war in American society, the Civil War, and 19th century US, but I also dabble in sports history. So if you had a chance to read my bio, you'll get an idea of like my background and my approach and what my interests are. But to kind of set your mind at ease, I need to spend a little bit of time talking about what to expect. So welcome to the first of 3 online lectures for our winter semester class. It's not too bad. They're only 15 to 22 minutes long. And for the most part, what I try to do is look at themes within each module. So in the first module, we explore the colonial period all the way up to the Gilded Age, close to the turn of the 20th century. And what I try to do is offer like themes that kind of approach this topic of sports to the current era. So this first theme looks at baseball and the professionalization of baseball. But what I'll also explore is the idea of myth-making, and how baseball is a reflection of American popular culture. So to start with, I think most of you have watched a game or part of a game and are familiar with the sport of baseball now in the current era. However, chances are that if you watch the origins of the game, like in the 1840s and the 1850s, you would hardly recognize the game at that age. The New York City Knickerbockers, for example, there's some resemblances to the modern game. They played in a diamond-shaped field. There were strikes called, but that's where the similarities kind of end. Because, for one thing, the umpires wore like big tall hats, kind of like the ones you see with Abraham Lincoln. They wore jackets with tails. And they didn't sit behind the catcher or stand behind the catcher like they do in the modern era. Instead, they were sitting behind a table along the first base line. Out in the outfield, there's no gloves for the fielders. It's just barehanded. And the catcher actually stood several feet behind the striker, otherwise known as the batter, hoping to catch the ball after one bounce. And the pitcher, he had a running start and would often pitch the ball underhanded, contrary to the modern day overhand approach. So it continues with differences. What we're familiar with now, the professional organized form of baseball, whether it's Major League Baseball, semi-pro baseball, or even college baseball, arguably one of the most popular tournaments in the NCAA. Well, the way baseball started was the complete opposite. It started as a fraternal sport. And in America in the 1840s, when baseball first began, there's plenty of fraternities. You could have a fraternity to be a railroad worker. There was fraternities of clockmakers, a fraternity for shoemakers, blacksmiths, things of that nature. So fraternities were kind of popular in terms of like how you worked. But baseball was an organized club, just like other sports of the era. There were prize fighting fraternities, club sports. There was horse racing. There were other blood sports. And what's very unique, I think, about all this is that it's not based on individualism for baseball. The other sports of America at this time, generally speaking, are individual sports. Baseball is like a team game. So with these differences, to kind of note, there's some key aspects of the origins of baseball. And one of those origins that I find very unique and different is just the level of happiness that people had. Baseball, when it began as a club sport, as an organized club sport, it was an opportunity for men. Women couldn't participate yet. It was an opportunity for men to forget about business. And basically everything else for that matter. One player actually said this in an interview with a newspaper. It was a chance to just kind of put the workplace aside. Men worked 6 days a week generally. And and this was the one opportunity that they had to kind of set all that aside. But baseball also gave men happiness because it allowed them a semblance of companionship, team camaraderie. It was, for many, a sense of belonging. As America is growing, as cities are beginning to kind of mushroom and begin their real growth, by the midpoint of the 19th century, this was an opportunity to kind of have a sense of belonging. And for players, naturally, it was a sense of joy to demonstrate their physical skills. Who could throw the fastest, the longest, who could hit, who could catch. It's that simple. And what is an additional difference to the game of baseball is just how unique the whole pageantry around the game actually was in its early years. For example, dances would follow baseball games. We're talking about formal dances, formal events following a game. It was like a big ritual where game balls would be exchanged, you'd inscribe each ball with a date, the winners, the scores, and it was a big, large-scale event that some pundits, some observers worried about baseball players, that they get more fatigued by the pageantry surrounding the game than the actual game itself. So certainly in the 1840s and the 1850s, enthusiasm began to build for the sport of baseball. As many of you know, the press, the media, encouraged all this. Newspapers contributed to baseball's growth and popularity. For one thing, there was daily newspaper coverage every day about clubs, trends, and what it led to was an affinity for baseball to begin to kind of think about statistics. Those of you that know the sport in the modern context realize that it's all about statistics. Batting averages, pitching, it's about the minutia. Baseball appreciates and covets these ideas. So by the 1860s, we have the very first baseball guidebook, which is a plethora of just statistics and what you could follow along those lines of data. So baseball in its inception began as kind of like a relaxed, fun thing for men to do, but the transformation really comes right after the American Civil War. And I think that it's a reflection of what happened during the war itself. Americans lost their lives, the frail nature of life itself, was something. And right around that time period, baseball began to be recognized as the quote-unquote national game. It actually began a few years before the Civil War, but the war itself just kind of accelerated everything that is tied into a national euphoria about the sport and about everything else for that matter. What Americans gravitated towards, this transformation as it begins, first and foremost, Americans love to talk about the Constitution, the flag, the national anthem, and because the newspapers had already talked about baseball as being the national game, that kind of coincided with everything else that's going on. The nation persevered 4 years of bloodletting, 4 years of warfare to kind of turn the page and begin to think about the future of the country. So that's the first transformation that begins to take place. The second transformation that begins to take place is baseball begins to gain respectability. And let me kind of begin to tell you how it does so. In the early years, in the first 2 decades of baseball, in the club sport era, rowdiness, drinking, and uncontrolled behavior, stuff that you could only imagine, fighting, bloodletting, all of these marked the first years of baseball. But during the Victorian age, you can't have that. You had to be more subdued. You had to be more precise. So one of the things that changed, the second thing that changed significantly, is that manliness began to be associated with the game of baseball. And what I mean by that is the idea of self-control. Generals, soldiers of the Civil War era were about control. I mean, nobody talked about PTSD, nobody spoke about, mental frailties, or at least they try not to, but self-control is about no boyish behavior. So the idea of manhood, manliness, was one of the transformative experiences of baseball to kind of move it into a more modern context. And then finally, as far as transformations go, baseball began to become a commercial enterprise after the Civil War. And let me kind of explain what I mean by this. At the height of its success, the baseball fraternities eventually gave way to commercialism. And this begins, one of the key elements is when fences are put up around those fields. So consider this, once those fences go up, that's the first wave of professionalization of the sport. Because when those fences went up, in came admission fees. And when those admission fees come in, voila, you have to pay players. So I know that Americans in the year 2025 like to think that baseball is, too corrupt, too modern, and they like to look back and think of simpler times. But I'm going to argue that those are manifestations of pop culture and Hollywood. I mean, we have movies like Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner. Talks about a simpler time when people played for just the appreciation of competition, that everyone was honorable, that men who played the game of baseball were above reproach. And this is found in many Hollywood movies about the sport. I mean, even another Kevin Costner film, it's entitled For the Love of the Game. And even though it talks about romance, it still has some elements of the importance and the love and the appreciation of a simpler time, when I say it's not really the case. When baseball began to become a commercial enterprise, the reality is like threefold. For example, because games now mattered and because people were earning a living or earning a wage through baseball, it was not a simpler, more romantic, more heroic time. In contrast, baseball gave way to like trickery. I mean, that was part of the game. See how if you could fool your opponents with like a hit and ball trick or substitution of players or feigning injuries. So cunning tactics were part of the game in the late 19th century. I know we like to think that Major League Baseball, allows too much cheating, that there's too much gamesmanship going on, but that goes all the way back, more than 120 years ago. So that's the first reality check. The second reality check is as soon as baseball moved into the realm of being a commercial enterprise, in came gambling. And very well, baseball has had an issue with organized gambling, not just in the current era, if you know what I'm talking about. 1920s, the 19-teens. I mean, there's been lifetime bans because of gambling. But gambling begins in the late 19th century. Not only in terms of the outcomes of games, but game dumping or fixing games becomes part of the lure. So that's another reality. And as far as like thinking about simpler, more nostalgic times, that is not the case because the fans didn't help. Riots, fights, those were part of the norm in the late 19th century. And to kind of give you a sense of like what the media, what the newspapers thought about baseball, in 1872, a New York newspaper published the following, quote, "Baseball players are nothing more than worthless, dissipated gladiators," unquote. And let me repeat that for emphasis. Baseball players are nothing more than worthless, dissipated gladiators. This is what one newspaper thought about baseball players. So clearly, baseball was on the ropes, and yet it persevered. We know that it persevered because of the modern context, but The reason baseball was able to overcome all these early controversies of the late 19th century is because, for one, baseball was super exciting. People were genuinely attracted towards this excitement. I mean, who would not want to see the skills of who could throw, who could catch, who could hit? People were enamored by those skills. And not just that, the idea of team rivalries also began to dominate the lore of baseball in the late 19th centuries. We now know that. I mean, there's documentaries about certain rivalries. Those of you that follow the game of baseball understand this. Those of you that know about college baseball, you know that there's college rivalries as well. But it begins like in the late 1800s. And finally, baseball had the opportunity for reputational building, building of reputations. I mean, what else can you have? It's the dawn of the age of heroes. And we're going to talk about heroes later on in this course, and we're not quite there yet, but it's coming. Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, and others. So the heroes of the late 19th century might not be as well known as the heroes of the modern context, but it's established. They are there. So certainly, when baseball players begin to organize themselves, and baseball has the National Association of Baseball Players in 1871, this is the precursor, way before the National League, but the semblance of organization already in the 1870s, no less. You have this idea that baseball is on the cusp of just expanding into uncharted territory. But because of that popularity, because of that growth, because of that media attention, we're also burdened by myths. Yeah, baseball has plenty of them, And one of the biggest myths of all is how the game came to be developed, how it was invented by Abner Doubleday. And I'm sure somebody in this class has heard the story of Abner Doubleday, how he invented the game of baseball. But that's a big myth. I mean, the game of baseball came from the British sport of rounders and like some other variations, base and ball. Doubleday never really claimed to have invented the game himself, but all this is just based on circumstantial evidence of like one letter. But it mattered to early leaders to kind of keep that myth going. I mean, for example, by the time this myth came to be, this is right after 1876. And 1876 is a centennial. There's a lot of patriotism going around in 1876. It's 100 years of America's celebration. In 1892 and 1893, Americans celebrate the Columbian Exposition in Chicago with an anniversary celebration of Columbus's discovery of America. So like those last few decades of the 19th century accentuate the idea of a creation myth. And even modern day Cooperstown, the birthplace of the Hall of Fame, they really didn't do enough to dissuade this. So it kind of stuck around for a long while. But I think that those myths kind of resonate with larger reflections of how baseball is kind of tied into American history on a larger macro level. I mean, for one thing, I hate to break this to you, but Americans are like prone to myth making and selective memory. I mean, I teach a class and we talk about World War II and how everyone thinks that it's like the good war, that Americans could do no wrong, that it's America's greatest generation. Myth making. The same thing with the Civil War. The heroes of the war were Southerners who fought against the federal government, and they became heroes in the national context, in the 20th century. So Americans have a propensity to kind of like make myths, kind of selective memory, so to speak. So it kind of is a reflection. Baseball is a reflection of American history as a whole. But at the same time, a second level of American history and baseball's reflection on it is that as soon as baseball became professional, in came the labor disputes. In 1879, the Players' Revolt, for example, was a reflection of what's going on in America. There are railroad strikes, there are steel strikes, later on there's going to be oil strikes, coal miner strikes, all within 2 decades worth of time. And this 1879 Players' Revolt, which was won by the owners came in and crushed it and did not allow players to have much leeway later on, something that the Baseball Players Association, their union, will eventually rectify in the late 20th century. Well, it's a reflection of what's going on in America at approximately the same time. Labor, management, their struggle to coexist and to each carve out part of that pie, that's part of what's going on in the United States. As was the third element, which is expansion. The West had expanded, but so did baseball. Not only did baseball expand into other cities, but like the United States is also expanding in the late 19th century, so did baseball. Baseball is being played in Cuba by American exports by the late 1880s. Yeah, there's investments, American investments in Cuba. And in case you didn't know, there's a war against Spain in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, and in the Philippines, the Spanish-American War. But it represents like that level of expansion that is kind of like a reflection of American history, because what is the NFL trying to do now? They're trying to expand the game to European markets, South American markets, and to extend that same level of growth on the world stage. And then finally, the fourth level of how baseball reflects American history and American society, it's an immediate reflection of the culture. For example, in the late 19th century, Civil War, Spanish-American War, baseball was violent. The fans were violent. The labor strikes were violent. Lives were lost. So it's a reflection of what's going on at the same time. And while America retracted from that violence, the game itself right now in the modern context, in the 21st century, is a reflection of how Americans think. Because baseball was considered, or is considered, like one of those sports, no clocks, no clock management. You play until the game is over. But what is going on right now is a reflection of American society. It's a reflection of American culture. Americans no longer have the patience to watch a 4-hour, 5-hour game like they did back in the 19th and early 20th century. So what's happening? Pitch clocks, efforts to try to speed up the game, to try to condense it to like a nice 3-hour television window. You know the drill. Other rules to try to help the offense, to try to help home run production. You must know about the late 20th century and performance-enhancing drugs and how they tainted the sport of baseball. But it's a reflection of what Americans wanted at the time. So what I'm trying to suggest is that baseball, in terms of American history, that it often serves as a mirror of like what's going on at the time. Late 19th century, it's a reflection of what's going on during that era. Late 20th century is a reflection of what's going on in that era. And the early 21st century becomes a reflection of what goes on in that era. So I think, and I suggest to you, that baseball is like a significant milestone for us to try to understand if we're trying to understand the history of the United States. But there will be more to come, and we'll touch base with other topics and other themes clearly as this course goes on. But in the meantime, I'll let you go, and we'll touch base soon. Thank you.